Okay, so I'm really excited to be able to talk about what I'm going to talk about today because I'm kind of a history nerd, and I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about church history. Now, here's the thing. None of y'all really care, okay? I promise there's a point. I promise I will try it together, but there's some stuff that we often miss when we don't realize kind of how the church came together and why we are where we are. And maybe, just maybe, as we've been talking about this idea that everything has a starting point, right? Your faith has a starting point. All of our faith has a starting point. I don't know where your faith began at, if you're like me, you grew up in the church, and when you grew up in the church, you were given all these stories, and you heard about Noah and Abraham and Moses, and you kind of all that had stuff was flowing in your head, and you started to kind of build together this idea of faith, right? And you heard about Jesus, and sometimes you mix the stories together and talked about Jesus getting the tablets from Mount Sinai or something like that happens. But we get all these stories kind of mixed around in our heads, and then we get this idea of what faith is. And somewhere along the way, for many of us, when we grew up, we went to college, we became adults or whatever, then we started to realize that some of the things we were experiencing, there was a gap between our experience and what we had kind of been told to believe. And maybe, just maybe, we hadn't actually owned our faith. We were kind of given faith, and we listened to what our parents said, but we never owned it on our own. And so we started talking about this idea that faith has a starting point. And particularly, I think the story of faith has a starting point as well. So wherever you started with faith, whether it was in Sunday school class or whether it was like a couple of years ago coming to church for the first time or anything in between, it had a starting point for you. And what we've been trying to discover together over these past few weeks is what is the actual starting point of faith? Like if we'd never heard any stories before, if we'd never been to church, if we'd never been to Sunday school, like where would we begin, right? And so we wrestled with this question in week 1, who is Jesus? And I asked you all to spend a full week saying, like, who is actually Jesus? And whether you're a Jesus follower or not, you've heard this name before, so you have to kind of wrestle to the ground who Jesus is. And then in week 2, last week, we started talking about this word that we all hate called sin, right? I didn't get a ton of pats on the backs for that message, just for the record. But we talked about this idea that we're not just mistakers, we're sinners, that there's something broken in our relationship with God, that something needed mending. And God was up to something in Jesus to make that happen, right? So this week, we're going to try to take those two things and put them together and examine kind of how this whole faith thing works for us. And then here's the premise of today is to put that stuff together. And then the promise of today is that once we do that, the rest of these weeks together, we're going to start building on that foundation. But I want to tell you about a character today who is someone that all 3 major world religions claim to be theirs. So the guy's name is Abraham. And there's a story about Abraham and you that I'm going to try to share with you today. But all 3 major religions actually claim Abraham. So if you talk to the Jews, they say, no, he's ours. And if you talk to Muslims, they say, no, he's ours. And if you talk to us as Jesus followers, they say, no, he's ours, right? And so all 3 kind of major world religions claim Abraham as one of their central characters. Now, we all kind of disagree about a lot of different things, and that's not really the point of today. But Abraham's a guy that you kind of need to know. So it's interesting to me that all 3 world religions start with the same premise, that God created the whole world and everything that's in it, and then at some point it became broken. We as Jesus followers in the Christian church, we talk about this idea that sin entered the world, the word we talked about last week. And the world became broken. It became a huge mess. Right? A mess that, like, how do you even start to clean this up? Have you ever had a mess like that at your house before? Like, have you ever spilled a gallon of paint before in your house? I have. It happened when we were trying to move, and you're like, maybe I should just sell the house, right? Rather than trying to clean this up. Or you ever had your dog get a hold of one of those, like our dog got a hold of one of those giant throw pillars on our couch and shredded it, and we came home and we're like, maybe we should just sell the house. I don't really know how to even begin to clean this mess up, and let's sell the dog too while we're at it, right? And you have this massive mess that happens, and you're like, where do I even start? Well, all three faith traditions say that that's kind of how the world got. That the world got so broken and so messy that it was just like, how could we even begin to do this, right? And all three faith traditions say that God kind of stepped in to try to clean up that mess. He had an option. God had an option to just, let's just hang a giant out of order sign on the universe and just give up. It had gotten that messy and it had gotten that terrible that God had the option to do that, but he chose not to. He chose to step into, break into our story and try to intervene, to try to make a difference. Let me break this down in a different way. There's a story that happened in my life not long ago that I think brought some context to this for me, and maybe it won't for you, maybe it will for you, but I want to share it with you. So we were living in the parsonage at Carrollton United Methodist Church. And so we're in this parsonage, and parents, you know that moment when you're at home and everything's too quiet? You know what that's like? And there's some anxiousness in you, like, I know they're into something, but I don't know what it is. Well, Shannon and I were in the living room sitting on the couch, and we had this feeling. And then we hear this noise. This noise from the kitchen that sounds like all the glass on planet Earth breaking, right? And it's not just like one crash, it's crash, 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 right? And so we get up and we look like, okay, here's what parents do, and this is awful, but we do this. You start immediately making an assessment. Like, you look around, what child is missing, right? So we knew where Kalen was, so we immediately knew it had to be Caden. He was my oldest. And we knew that he had this habit of kind of, y'all ever seen Rugrats where Tommy Pickles climbed and got out of things? That's Caden. If there was ever a child, that was him. And he had this really bad habit of trying to, it was an old house, so he would pull the drawers out and build a staircase to get on the countertops. And then he would get on the countertops and get into snacks, right? He was just a daredevil from day one. Well, this particular day, he didn't get in the right cabinet. And if you've been to my house recently, you know we all drink out of mason jars. It's because of what I'm about to tell you, okay? Caden had tried to get in the cabinet where all of our glassware was, all of our cups, our coffee cups, our glasses, all of our plates. We were a poor, newlywed couple, living in a parsonage, not making a ton of money, so everything we owned is really in one cabinet. And he had pulled the shelf down, and every shelf, every plate, every cup, every coffee mug, everything had just shattered on the floor. And it was one of those old linoleum floors. Maybe you don't know what that means, but it was like this really slick floor, and just went everywhere. And so Shannon and I hear this massive, terrible crash from our kitchen. We go running in, and we find our 6-year-old standing on the countertops, mortified, saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And every glass thing we own is shattered on the ground. And it was a sea of glass. I mean, it was everywhere. It was spread from one side of the kitchen to the other. And there he is, wide-eyed, standing on the countertop. And the problem was, he wasn't getting down because there was nowhere to go. He was stuck on the countertop, and there's all this glass between us and him. So I look at my son, and I point my finger at him, and I say, you shouldn't have touched that cabinet. Clean this mess up and let me know how it goes. And I said, Shannon, come on, let's go watch TV. What are you laughing for? No, you know I didn't do that, right? I mean, what kind of father would do such a thing? But the weird thing is, if I just might stay for a minute, this is kind of what we do to God sometimes. We picture God as looking at the mess in our life and going, well, as soon as you clean that up, we'll talk again. But that's not how God works with us at all. And that's not really how I related to my son either. No, what did I do? Well, I stood up and I'm looking and I'm assessing the floor because he's from me to the fourth row across this sea of glass. And so I take my foot and I start raking plates out of the way, right? And just kind of scooting, and then I just crunch across the little pieces. And I grab my son and I take him in the living room and I put him in the playpen with his sister and try to lock it in there. We won't get out, that kind of thing. I was one of those moments. And then my wife and I go back to the kitchen and we're trying to figure out where to start. Where do we clean up this mess? How do I even begin? What's step one? And what I think is, if I might say, the story of Abraham is really God's way of stepping into our situation. All of us were stuck on a countertop across a sea of glass, and God had to start somewhere. And all three major faith traditions, though we veer off, and I'll tell you where, all three major faith traditions decide that God started with Abraham. That the first piece of glass that God raked out of the way was to intervene in a guy's life by the name of Abraham. Now here comes the church history part, and I promise there's a point, but hear me out for a second. In 1876 BC, this is 2,000 years before Jesus, 4,000 years ago, this guy by the name of Abraham lived. And no one debates this. No one debates that Abraham was alive. We all have a kind of a fixed time in which his life existed. And in 1876 BC, this guy named Abraham had God intervene in his life. And what's amazing to me is, again, I think if we look at Abraham as kind of God's first step it seems like a strange one. Hear me out. Abraham was not a perfect guy. In fact, let me just give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of some of the great stories from Abraham's life. Did you know that Abraham, when he was wandering through Egypt at one time with his young and beautiful wife at the time, Sarah, that Pharaoh somehow, some way spotted Sarah and said, you know what, I'll take that one. I mean, that's how broken the world had gotten. That's how messy everything was. And it goes against all of our civilities to even think about it today. But in that time, you want to talk about how messy stuff is now. Just think of how it was then. Pharaoh just goes, that woman, I'll take that one. And so he sent a servant out to Abram and said, hey, listen, Pharaoh has spotted this woman and he would like her. Is this your wife? And brave, courageous, godly Abraham, do you know what he does? He goes, that's not actually my wife. She's kind of like my sister. Here, you can have her, right? Because he was thinking he's going to kill me and he's going to take my wife, so I'll just get a new one, right? Right? If you think you've got loyalty issues in your relationship, right? I mean, think about that. Has anybody ever tried to give you away before? But that's Abraham. He was not like a perfect guy by any means. He had a broken story. And that's why I love it, because Abram was kind of the example of God saying, I've got to start somewhere. I've got to start somewhere. And so it says in Genesis chapter 12, the beginning of Abram's story, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land that I will show you. In other words, listen, I've got this place that I want you to go, and I've got plans for you, but I need you to leave everything that you know behind. So go to this new place. And hey, because it's kind of got to read between the lines, good luck telling your family that this is all the plan, okay? But he makes several promises to Abraham. This is what's fascinating about God's relationship with him. He has to start someplace, right? And probably Abram is asking the same question that a lot of the rest of us ask. The reason that you don't really care all that much about church history is because the question you're often asking of God is not, where did you come from? Or how did I get here? It's, are you and I good? Are we okay? Is everything kosher between us? Are we all right? And Abram's asking himself those same kind of questions. Like, what is it? I feel like my life's not going where I want it to go. And I don't really have an heir yet, and I don't have any kids, and so God shows up and he's about to make several promises, but Abram's all along questioning himself like, are we okay? And I know you have to have asked this question or wrestled with this question before, especially if God has asked you to do something, right? There's this level of trying to understand what it is that God is to you, or where God comes from, or what he wants for you. And Abram starts wrestling with this. And in the midst of that wrestling, God makes 3 very interesting promises. Now, just for where we're at right now, especially if you're a cynic to the faith, I'm not telling you absolutely have to believe these promises and where they came from. I just want you to notice something about what I'm about to say. For the rest of us that are already kind of Jesus followers, I want you to see how all of this stuff fits together, okay? So here's promise number 1. God said, if you do this and go to this nation, this place I'll tell you to go, I will make you a great nation. To which all of the Jewish people today would go, yep, that one came true. Isn't it interesting that this one came true? We're a great nation. And just for the record, the Arab nations claim Abraham too. So they're like, yeah, look, we're a great country, and we're a great country. Look, this came true, right? And whether or not you believe however this came together, it's fascinating to me that this promise made 4,000 years ago has obviously come true. Now, this second one's even better. Number 2. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great. Just let's participate with me for a minute. Before you came in here, before I started talking, how many of y'all had actually heard the name Abraham? Would you please raise your hand? Yeah, that's like all of us. And at home, you're raising your hand too, right? All of us in a different nation, in a different culture, 4,000 years later, have heard the name Abraham. What about this name? Show of hands. How many have ever heard of Chedorlaomer? Pastors in the room can't raise your hands, by the way. You ever heard of Chedorlaomer? Quick show of hands. No? Nobody's ever heard of Chedorlaomer before? Did you know that he was the king of Edom during Abraham's day? You ever heard of Edom? Can you find it on the map for me? You actually can't. Spoiler alert, it's just a pile of dirt today. It doesn't even exist. Isn't it fascinating, right? That a king who had a crown, who was a ruler in the same time as Abraham, we don't even know who he is. But this no-name guy, this average Joe, everybody knows who Abraham is. Today, in a different country, in a different tongue, in a different language, thousands of years later. We don't know the king from that day, but we know Abraham. So regardless of what you think, I think we can count that promise as coming true. I will make your name great, God says. Well, here we are. And whether you know everything about Abraham or not, you know who he is. We've all kind of heard of him before. Now, promise number 3. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. To which, again, all 3 major faith traditions will go, yep, that came true, right? The Jewish people will go, absolutely. Have you seen what we as Jewish people have done and the way the world has been blessed through what we've done? And we as Christians, we go, you know what? Have you seen all the hospitals and the orphanages and all the nonprofits and all the great things that are happening? We have blessed the world, and on and on and on. It doesn't say individual, like one people. This means nations. All the groups in the world will be blessed through you. And all of us that go, hey, Abraham's ours, or no, he's not, he's ours, or no, he's ours. All of us are saying the world has been blessed because of what he did. Isn't that fascinating? I find that incredibly interesting. Now look, that's the history stuff. Okay, so done with the history. That's as deep as we have to go for right now. There's a point to this. You see, it's not just Abraham's story, it's how Abraham impacts you. It's Abraham and you. And what I love about what's about to happen in Abraham's story that I'm going to share with you is Abraham got, again, to the same place where we get, where he was wrestling with whether God was really who he said he was. Abraham found himself older in life. He was late in life at this point. He was in his 80s. And the promises that he'd been given from God, look, we can look at them 4,000 years later and go, those absolutely came true because we can see it. But, Abraham's living it. And he's like, I don't know. God promised this, but did I do something wrong? Or are we good? How many times have you asked yourself that question? God, are we good? Even if you're still trying to figure out who God is or who Jesus is, we all wrestle with that there's something bigger going on, and we want to know if we're okay. And so Abram's wrestling. And the problem is, Abram's old enough now that he's looking and kind of examining his life at the end chapters of it. And he's saying, I don't have an heir. I don't have someone who I'm going to leave all my possessions to. And his servant, Eleazar, who you don't know who that is either. Some of y'all do, probably not. Eleazar was his kind of head servant. And so he was wrestling with this thing that I'm going to die, and all this wealth I'm going to have to leave to him because I don't have a son. I don't have an heir to give this to. And so he finds himself praying. It's like, God, are you listening? Are you out there? Do you remember me? How many of y'all have prayed like that before? I mean, gosh, I have. Sometimes in silly ways, like, God, if I really need to pass this test. And no, I didn't study, but it would be really great if you could just show me that you're here and get me through it. Maybe it's more complicated than that. God, I feel like my life is falling apart. You said you were with me, and you said you had my back, and I don't know, are we good? I mean, this is something so visceral about what Abraham is wrestling with that I think we can connect with. And here's how God responds. This is important. This is how God responds. In Genesis chapter 15, he says this, Then the word of the Lord came to him, speaking to Abraham, this man, Eleazar, the servant, will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And then he took him outside. I love this. He took him outside and he said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you even can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Now, I grew up close to Cincinnati, which meant when I looked up into the sky, they were like 3 stars. Right? And then you realize one of them's an airplane and there's actually just 2 stars, okay? But here in Tuscaloosa, it's a little bit better. And even better, in Abraham's day, he's out in the desert. And he's like, there's no light pollution. And they look up and it's the Milky Way. It's like thousands of stars. And God's like, look, count them if you can. That's how much your offspring will be, okay? And look, Abraham has no son at this point. And you may be saying to yourself, like, as we look at this forward, like, God's trying to make a plan to fix this whole mess in the world, and this is where he has started. This seems like a very strange piece of glass to slide out of the way. This seems like a very strange step number 1. And Abraham didn't fully understand what God was doing, but God had a plan, and this was step 1. So Abram, in the center of this moment where he's been promised these things he can't see yet, does something miraculous. And as far as I can tell, what I'm about to read to you is the first moment in all of Scripture where we start to fully understand what God's plan is to fix this mess. And it's so powerful and it's so amazing. And some of us have read Genesis 100 times because we started on our 12-month reading plans and then we give up around Exodus. And so you just read Genesis over and over again. I guarantee you've read this verse before and you've just missed it. Or you haven't thought about it. But this is huge. This is massive. What's about to happen, it completely relays what God was up to and what he's about to do next. And it's the first time that I can find when God ever did this. And as someone who loves to study this stuff, I would love to be proven wrong, but I don't think that I am. Here's what he says. This is awesome. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. So Abram believed the Lord, and he, God, credited to him as righteousness. Wow, think about this for a minute. Okay, just think about this for a second. God says, Abram, I know you don't have any kids. I know you don't have a son. And I know you're worried about having to give all your stuff away to your servant. But look, I have a plan. Do you trust me? Do you trust me? And Abram goes, you know what? This is hard. And this is kind of scary. And you don't know, God, I don't know how you're going to bring all this together. But yeah, I trust you. I believe these promises. And God credited it. I grew up with the word reckoned. God reckoned it to him as righteousness. Now, wow. Righteousness means right standing with God. This is hundreds of years before the Ten Commandments. Okay, this is 2,000 years before Jesus. This is before 2,600 years before Islam. This is huge. This is massive. This is before Moses. This is before Mount Sinai. Any of that. The law didn't exist. Jesus hadn't been born yet. And God looks at Abram and says, do you trust me? And because Abram trusted, it was credited to him, reckoned to him, given to him a right standing with God. In other words, let me put this in a different way. Trusting God resulted in a right standing with God. I think so many of us have been confronted with the question, God, are we okay? And where we go wrong is misunderstanding what it is that God is asking from us. God is saying, do you trust me? I've got a plan. Do you trust me? And the problem is, look, we get this honest. This is not like, what I'm about to say, I'm not being critical of world religions, okay? So don't hear this as criticism. I'm just pointing out the facts, okay? The Jewish people, when they were asked, like, how do we get right with God? The Jews go, well, you get right with God by becoming a Jew, right? And you become a Jew, and then once you're a part of our family, then you're a child or a daughter of Abraham, and you get grafted into this plan. And then you're right with God. Next slide, please. And then the Muslims, they go, well, like, okay, what it is you have to believe in the one true God. And once you believe in the one true God, then you have to do works of righteousness. And you do all these acts of righteousness. And then at the end of your life, all of that stuff gets added up. And it's subtracted or added together. And then God will decide whether all of your acts and works have been enough to get you into his presence. And you won't know until the end. And then something like 30 minutes after Jesus ascended back to heaven, the Christians started wrestling with the same very thing. And I can just imagine Jesus going, don't make me come back down there, right? But they did. The Christian church started going, well, you have to become a Jew in order to become a Jesus follower. And so they were like, there was a whole group of people who said, you have to start following the law of Moses. And you have to be circumcised. And you have to come in and become of the Jewish faith before you become a Jesus follower. And there was a whole other group of people led by Paul going, they don't know how to follow the law of Moses. They've never heard it before. That's not what this is about. They said Jesus is at the center, and they started wrestling this. And all the way through the Reformation, the church has been wrestling with this question, what makes us good with God? Is it birth? Is it behavior? Is it belief? Is it some combination of the three? How do I know that God and I are good? That we're okay? How do I know that our relationship has been reconciled? And maybe, like you were with me last week, and you've accepted this idea that there's something broken between us and God. And you're like, yeah, I know, there's something broken between us and God. And now you're wrestling with, how on earth do I get that fixed? Well, that is a question, my friends, that we have been wrestling with through thousands of years of church history. And if I might say, this is that verse. This is the point where Jews go in one direction and Muslims go in another direction and Christians go in another direction. This is the catalyst. This is the breaking point. All right? And so we all have to answer this question. What is it that makes us right with God? And let me say, what if the starting point for a relationship with God is just trust? This is the starting point, okay? I'm not saying this is all there is to faith. This is the starting point. What if what God has been trying to do in Jesus by saying he is the way and the truth and the life is to say, in an essence, do you trust me? What if all of us were stuck on a countertop behind our own sea of glass, and there was one plan that God's been working on for thousands of years to get us out of that mess, to clear the way, and to bring us back to reconcile with us, and it's in Jesus. And the starting point of it is trust. What if God really has been reaching out to you your entire life, asking you the simple question, do you trust me? Now, there's a reason this is hard, okay? There's a reason this is hard. Some of us grew up in the church, and we got this whole idea of salvation is grace plus faith plus nothing. We got it easy. But others of us grew up in the church where we said, well, our behavior gets thrown into this. Or maybe, honestly, there's not another part of our life. There's not another part of your life where this makes sense, right? You didn't join the baseball. You didn't make the baseball team because the coach, you were trusted, or you trusted the coach. Alabama does not win national championships because they just trust the system. They work at it, right? And they achieve. And there's trophies at the end. And we all know this. You grow in your career and you move up the ladder by working harder. And the harder you work, the further you climb. And the further you climb, the more achievement you get. There's not another place on earth that the bottom rung is this low. So you get it honest. But what if God has been trying throughout countless ages of history he's just simply saying, do you trust me? What if the entire plan, all the way up until Jesus, what did Jesus say? He said, repent and believe the gospel. Do you trust me? Some of us have been trying to clean ourselves up, clean up our own mess, before we trust our Heavenly Father. Some of us have tried to climb down into the glass, and we've got cuts on our feet to prove it, because we think that's what we have to do. We think we have to clean it up. We have to fix it. We have to deal with it first, and then God will take us. But what if God is saying, no. Trust me. Do you trust me? And the challenge for us is deciding whether we're going to say yes. Now, week 1, I asked you to wrestle with the question, who is Jesus, right? And last week we talked about sin being the sea of glass that keeps us together. What if when Jesus said he is the way and the truth and the life, he actually meant it? And there's not anything else you have to do. The Christian life, there's more to it. Salvation is simple, though. Salvation is simple. You want to get out of the mess that you're in. You want to get across the sea of glass. You want to see how God has been working to clean up the mess that we've made of the world. Trust him. I think that's what he's been trying to say all along. I think that's what he started with Abraham. I think that's what he was doing through Moses. I think that's what he was doing through the prophets. I think that's what he was doing through Jesus. I think that's what he did through Paul and through all the churches and through all the countless centuries, all the way through the Reformation. I think that's what he was doing when he planted this church. I think that's what he was doing when he was calling me here. And I think that's what he was doing when he asked you to get up this morning, to show up, to come here and hear this message. Do you trust me? And my friends, I can say without a shadow of a doubt in my heart that God is trustworthy. And no matter how much you want to complicate the system, all he is asking you to do is believe. Do you believe? We're going to end our service here. And a couple of the band members are going to come up and sing another song. But I want to throw a discussion question on here first. And I've given you one every week. So, I've been hearing from a lot of great discussion from our small group leaders. And maybe you've been doing this with your spouse on your way home. But maybe I got you. Maybe you're here, right? Maybe you're agreeing, but let's back up for a minute. When you walk through the room today, which of the following best reflected your view on how you got right with God? Was it, where you were born? Because you were born to be a Christian, and maybe some of y'all were baptized as infants, and you're like, we're good. Was it your behavior? I've been a good person, or I've been a bad person, therefore God and I aren't good? Or is it your belief? Or is it some combination of the three that you've grown up thinking this is where I build my foundation on? What is it? What is it that you have decided best gets you reckoned to God? And then, what do you think now? The band is going to sing one of my favorite songs. It's Amazing Grace, My Chains Are Gone. And I like this song because it reminds us that God had one plan. And he gave it to us for free. And it's not something you can earn. It's not something that you deserve. It's not something that you were born into or that you can behave well enough to get. It's a gift. And if you can get to a place where you realize it's a gift, then you can sing at the top of your lungs, "My chains are gone and I've been set free." But you got to trust Him. I'm going to pray for you. And Jeremy and a couple of the band members are going to come up. We're going to sing this song together. And you can stay seated or you can stand during this song, but this is your time to kind of reflect for a few minutes. So would you bow your heads with me? Gracious God, as we think about the last 4,000 years of church history, you have had but one goal, and that has been to reach us, to cross the mess, the gap, the canyon, the sea of glass between us and you. You have been working diligently to prove your trustworthiness to us and to continually ask us that question, do you trust me? God, it's easy for me to sit up here on the stage and to trot it out like this. It's easy for us to sit in this protective room and to think these things, but it's a completely another one to put this in practice in our lives, to put it in practice. To stop saying it's about earning your trust or your favor, or to stop saying that it's about where we were born or who we are, and just to simply say that you love us just because of who we are and that you are trustworthy. So I just pray that you will open our minds and our hearts and our souls to the gospel, to the good news in Jesus. And it's good news because it's grace, and that grace is free, and that grace is amazing. So God, speak to us in a powerful way today and tomorrow. Draw us back together as we continue this idea of building our foundation of faith. We love you. We ask in the name of your Son, our Savior, and our Lord, Jesus Christ.